Good morning. So I'm back at it with the 4 agreements, and I wanted to dissect and give my insight with regards to don't make assumptions, which is the 3rd agreement. I was struggling today. I'm dragging ass and finding energy from I don't know where right now because I had a very difficult week. But I wanted to slap on some makeup and show up for myself because showing up for myself at this point in my life is doing the things that I find very difficult to do or struggle to do despite being being perfect, being 110% prepared. All of these are things in my head. It's not that anyone puts it on me or there's any pressure to do this. I just want to commit and follow through with myself. So I made notes about the 3rd agreement. We assume we know what others want or mean, and we're usually wrong. Assumptions are the fastest way to misunderstand, create conflict, and suffer unnecessarily. That last one is the one that truly hit home to me. Or, yeah, did I get it right this time? Hit home for me? I don't know. I keep botching that phrase. We treat assumptions as facts, then react to a story we made up in our heads. Most of the pain in your life didn't come from what actually happened. It came from what you assumed was happening. I asked myself, why do we make assumptions? Humans want to know. The mind is designed to dislike ambiguity. So it invents explanations. Our agreements, the ones we've agreed to, the ones that have been put upon us, like our belief systems, wounds, conditioning, all of these automatically fill the gaps for us as individuals. Asking questions requires a sacrifice, and that sacrifice is our own vulnerability. Emotions get in the way. Egos and perceptions of what others might think interfere with our vulnerability. How do we opt in to creating our own suffering? We assume someone's silence is rejection. We assume tone means disrespect. We assume that delay means disinterest. We get defensive, build resentment, create drama within our own heads without any confirmation. Don Miguel Ruiz's observations and insight is that most emotional pain, or should I say most emotional poison is what he refers to, comes from assumptions layered on top of expectations. When expectations aren't communicated, we assume others should know. When they don't, we feel unseen, hurt, unvalued, dismissed. Insert your favorite adjective. But the other person was never informed. These create silent contracts that no one agreed to. Needs that are not being met and resentments being born unbeknownst to the other party. My solution to all of that is something that I've started to do recently is communicate my needs. Not just communicate my needs for myself, but also ask of others to communicate their needs to me. And what I found it has created an immense opportunity to understand the people around me. And it has given me the opportunity to rebuild relationships. And it has provided me clarity to understand that people are human beings as well. So communicate your needs. This is how I've been applying that. Ask questions, even if they feel uncomfortable. Clarify instead of interpreting. Express what you want instead of expecting what others think you want, or what you think that they may think that they can do for you. And how that translated for me in my life was that I, at 43, have had character run-ins with my parents and with my children. And you add trauma in between all of those people, and my interpersonal relationships were very charged. And that left me overgiving, that left me feeling unseen, underappreciated, overextended. And that translated into the 3D world as someone who was high-strung, violent, aggressive, angry, tired, sick. And I didn't see how one thing like correlated with the other, or one thing like could affect the other. Like, so for example, I allowed the world, or I experienced the world with, oh, this is happening to me. Life is happening to me. And I, somewhere along the line, removed my own personal authority to it. It may have shown itself in glimpses in my lifetime, but where I stood in my own personal authority, and where I stood where like unshakable, like really internally, that didn't exist. So you add like these agreements and these resentments from childhood, and then you add raising children and being responsible for their minds, their souls, their health, and their overall well-being. And then you add yourself, and myself was always at the back burner. And I had like a good, maybe over a decade of being chronically ill. And somehow everything that I endured sort of stripped away me as a person. I just became this agreement of being ill and letting life happen to me, and just having to endure. And then, you know, all these things of how we romanticize pain just as well as we romanticize love. We and happiness, we romanticize pain, where, oh, like it's a Nike commercial, we're just gonna do it, and it's just gonna be like, oh my God, like you just gotta man up. And I would always tell myself, man up, like man up, and tell my kids, man up. And I don't think I emotionally saw them, and I don't think I emotionally saw myself. And you're like, well, what the hell does this have to do with assumptions? And it's because I didn't communicate my needs. I thought that self-sacrifice and just putting up with things and just doing it myself because nobody else could do it like me, or no one else was equipped to do it for whatever reason. I made excuses for their behaviors. I made excuses for my behaviors. And I carried that that burden, and I carried that emotional weight, and I carried the emotional workload for everyone around me. It was not properly distributed, and I made assumptions of what they were capable of doing, and I made assumptions of what I was capable of doing, rather than saying, I've had enough. I'm unhappy. I am not capable of managing X, Y, Z on top of A, B, C, and D, and all the things in between. I can't manage that for you. I can't manage that for them. I can't manage myself. And I found myself so miserable. And then I started to be a little bit impeccable with my word. And then my positive talk inside, the room in my head started to adjust and pivot. And my perspective changed. And then I started to realize that how am I supposed to expect others to show up for me if I expect the worst out of them? Or I expect that they are not capable of doing so, because either they didn't meet other instances to my expectation. They didn't do it as great as I did. They did it halfway. Well, they did it halfway because I didn't make them accountable. They didn't do it as great as I would have because I didn't allow them the opportunity to learn. I didn't establish boundaries and say, hey, no, that work belongs to you. It doesn't belong to me. That's not my job. And when you realize that you are responsible for you, you are responsible for the way you talk to yourself. You're responsible for the way you think. You are also responsible for the way you express, or the choice to not express yourself, not to be clear, not to be clean with your word. So we project our own beliefs and fears and values onto others and ourselves. So if we think that because our past experiences and our past traumas and people taught us about themselves, how much of what they taught us was that was them, or how much of it was it that we perceived that to be? What did we put on them? In the silence that we carry between us, the things that we don't tell them. We interact with these people every day, but we don't tell them what we're really feeling. We don't say that, hey, you hurt me when you did this last time. It hurt me that I was in the hospital and you chose to do X, Y, and Z instead of show up for me because I needed your comfort. I have my own children say, hey, I don't need you to solve this for me. I need you to just be my mom. And that was this week. And guess what? I'm so proud of that because she communicated her need. And then I realized it wasn't it wasn't my job to battle plan and, figure things out for her. Carry that type of workload for her. It was my job to just sit on the couch, have her sit on my lap, like rest her head on my lap and rub her head and rub her back and be a mom and meet that emotional need. I fell into these places where I used to fix it all, and I chose, wait a minute. If I fix it all the time, what happens? What is the system in place for when I am not here? Who's going to fix it? You have to allow people the personal authority to step up for themselves, to show up for themselves, the same way that you have to show up for yourself. How did making assumptions about people affect my interpersonal relationships? I carried the traumas and I made these agreements, and I didn't deal with the inner child that was hurting as a grown-up. And as a grown-up, I started to realize what this inner child was still aching for or needed that balance or that stability. And realized that my happiness and that stability, I have to create that for myself. If it wasn't meant, I have to nurture that inner child, the things that weren't done, but I have to do that for myself. It's not something that I have to get exclusively from my parents. But how do you grow into adulthood and reconcile your past with your parents and still have a good relationship with them? And how do you forgive them? And how do you move past all of that? Well, I don't know all the answers to it. And that comes in and out on stages. It's not going to always... Ring wants to talk when it doesn't need to talk. But it's probably the ducks that tend to walk around like in front of the house. But what I'm trying to say is that I had the choice to say, do I want to be miserable around my family, around these interpersonal relationships, my core tribe, the people that I have lived with all my life? Do I want to address that these gaps have occurred in our connection? And my first step was pointing fingers and saying, hey, you did this to me. You did this to me. And I felt gaslit. The response that I got was, you would think it probably come across as ambivalence, or they don't remember things being the same way. And then I think about this book and it's like, how do they perceive their life? How do they perceive our upbringing? How do they perceive how they showed up for us? And the world that they live in is not the world that I live in. And when I release myself from all of that, if they live in one world and I live in my world, whose world do I need to be okay being in? Because the one that I'm experiencing each and every day, the pains, the throes of it, all the woes, the wounds and everything are mine. And it establishes personal authority. It gives me permission to know that I can change my world, the way I feel, the way I experience it. So did I want to continue to experience my adult elderly parents the way that I experienced them as children? Did I want to continue to look at them through the lens of the inner child that I hadn't healed? Did I want to like measure and dissect them and see if that's who I wanted to be around? I had to take more accountability for that for myself. And I needed to be able to say, hey, I can shift. I can shift the way I interact. I can shift by being clear. I communicate my needs. So I'll give you an example. My dad loves to walk my dogs. And so I'll call him. And I used to call him and I'm like, hey, I'm about to pick you up in X amount of time. Be ready. And then I never took into account what he was doing in his own home. I never took into account that, you know, he might be busy. He might be in the middle of X, Y, and Z. So when I started to look and take into not assuming things about people, assuming what they're doing, assuming what they're thinking, and started asking questions, I realized that sooner or later, I didn't have these miscommunications. I didn't have the arguments. I didn't have the resentments, as they weren't as loud in my head, because I was getting my needs met, because I was being clear, and I was also being understanding. And it created the opportunity for me to understand that they are human beings and they have their own lives and their own personal experience. So when I would rush him and be like, oh, you got to be ready and be mindful of my time. And I'd get over there. And if he was delayed, it would frustrate me. It'd anger me. It would make me like outraged. And I realized that one of my non-negotiables is for people to respect my time, respect my energy, respect the how I show up for them in their world or in mine. And I realized that I wasn't doing that. The things that I wanted, I wasn't doing. And I had to be accountable for that. So I've been able to shift my relationship with my parents little by little. You know, when you establish boundaries and when you say no to the things that they were used to, they're going to rebel. They're going to be upset. And there may be days where you don't speak to them. But silence is not meant to be assumed that they are upset. They're angry. They don't love you. You're giving too much credit to another person's personal world. And so what I would say is allow yourself the opportunity to understand that you're not that special. They have their own problems, their own burdens, their own inner child. The same way that I'm trying to make sense out of the things in my head, in my room, how I like to read my interpersonal relationships, they do it in their own way. They also have their own emotional capacity. And your parents' emotional capacity may not meet your emotional capacity. If you look around, you may be the only person in that setting that has the skill set to understand trauma, how that affects you, the ripple effects in the family, the ancestral trauma, the things that you carry in the silence, the things that are left unsaid because you're scared to acknowledge these problems. Assumptions that we make is not just with others, it's also with ourselves. I should have already known this. I should be further along. If I were better, this wouldn't happen. If you understand that these assumptions fuel shame, guilt, comparison, and self-judgment, you're going to be ahead of the game. The author highlights that self-assumptions keep us trapped in false identities. Take the time to examine yourself. Replace assumptions with questions, curiosity, and listening. Did I interpret this correctly? Ask yourself. What is this reflecting to me? Is this person, like, I used to say, hey, can you help me out with something? And they'd be like, and I would like, oh, never mind. And I didn't think that they wanted to help me. And what I didn't take into account is that they have food on the stove. Because I was involved in my world and they were involved in theirs. Be mindful and respect that people are experiencing things on different levels. Emotional freedom through clarity is obtained when you communicate your needs. This is going to help you. It's going to help us when we communicate them in our relationships with our parents, our children, our spouses, your next door neighbor, your clients. Understand that happiness comes from being understood because you've communicated your need. Have a great day.